finished this section 1 sample hypothesis testing with this idea of examining what we call type 1 and type 2 errors. What that is that we make decisions about claims in the world, and just because we make a decision doesn't mean they're right. Remember, we're making these decisions based on some level of confidence, right? At some alpha level, right? There's a chance that we could be incorrect with our decision. And so type 1 errors occur when type 1 error occurs, right, when we reject the null hypothesis, but the null hypothesis is actually true. That's a type 1 error. If we reject the null hypothesis and the null hypothesis is false, that's a correct conclusion. So remember, we reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis, but just because we do that, we're not necessarily 100% correct all the time. And so a type 1 error is when you reject the null hypothesis, right? We say reject, but in the real world, the null hypothesis is actually true. A type 2 error occurs when we say fail to reject, right? We say fail to reject the null hypothesis, but the null hypothesis is actually not true, it's false. And so we have these two situations. We're correct when we say fail to reject the null hypothesis. When the null hypothesis is true, we don't reject it if it's true, right? And so we have these situations in the real world. There's 4 situations that occur. Type 1 errors and type 2 are when we make decisions that are incorrect. And that's this idea of interpreting the errors, right? And so you have it here in writing. We rejected the null hypothesis, but it was actually correct. We fail to reject when we know it, when it's not true, right? And so we have some specific situations here that we can examine, putting it into context. 10% of all people write with their left hand, or here are the hypotheses that would go with that, right? The null hypothesis is that the proportion is 10%. The alternative is that it's not equal to 10%. And so a type 1 error is us concluding that the proportion of left-handed writers is not 10% when it actually is 10%, right? A type 1 error occurs when we reject the null hypothesis. A type 1, reject when it's actually true. You're going to have to read that and think about that. A type 2 error in this case, right? Type 2, we fail to reject. So we conclude that the proportion of left-handed writers is 10% because we fail to reject. But in reality, it's not 10%, right? 10% are not left-handed. And so again, we have these types of errors when we run a hypothesis test. Here's another example, right? The null hypothesis is that 1%, there's a defect of 1%, okay? And we're trying to see, is there evidence that the defect rate is higher than 1%? And so that's where we get the alternative. Type 1 error is, again, type 1 error, coming back to the type 1. Type 1 error is we reject the null hypothesis when it's actually true. So we conclude that the defect rate is greater than, right? When in fact it's supposed to be, when it is 10%. Type 2 error, we say the defect rate is 1% when in reality the defect rate is actually greater than. You got to think about that. It's a kind of a logic thing, but think about it in a real world scenario about how you there's a claim made, and if you reject it, you could be right, right? If you don't reject it, you could be right, or you could be wrong also, right? And it goes either way, right? Just because you reject or don't reject, you could be correct or incorrect. Those are called type 1 and type 2 errors. And in this case about defect rates, we would say consumers would be worse for consumer in type 2, right? A type 2 error, meaning that you think the defect rate is 1% when in reality it's greater than, right? And so a type 2 error actually hurts a consumer more. Again, think about this in the context of a court case where you say a defendant is not guilty, right, when he actually is guilty, or tell a defendant you're guilty when they're not guilty, right? And so think about that. You're guilty when you're not actually guilty, right? That definitely is more harmful to the defendant. Same type of thinking going on here with who's hurt with the consumer in these decisions and claims, right? And so here's just another example. You can go ahead and take a look at and what is a type 1 error in this context. conclude that the proportion of seniors is not 40% when it actually is. Remember, type 1, we reject the null hypothesis when it's actually true. And so what we're saying here is we're saying, okay, you're not true and you're true, but it's an error. So the error is what? This is a type 1. We're rejecting this when it's actually true, when the percent is actually 40%, but we rejected that. Okay. And then lastly, there's not a lot of homework problems on this. It's an idea of thinking about this idea of power, and power is the probability of correctly rejecting a false null hypothesis, right? When you actually reject a null hypothesis when it's false, right? You saying reject the null hypothesis when it actually is. That's called the power, right? Or the probability of rejecting a false null hypothesis, okay? It's the complement of a type 2 error. And so when we think about this in the world, the power of a test depends on the true value of a parameter, which is what we don't know. But the more powerful the test, the better, right? If we're rejecting, if we're rejecting a null hypothesis when it's actually false, that's a good thing there. And so there are two ways to increase the power of a test: increase the sample size and increase your alpha level. Actually, that increases the power of the test. That's it.